Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On this week's episode, I'm speaking to Israeli anti-Zionist historian and academic, Professor Ilan Pappé. Professor Pappé has dedicated decades of his life to writing and speaking about the Nakba of 1948, shedding light on what actually happened and what a grave catastrophe it was and continues to be. He calls for a one-state solution and for the right of return for all Palestinians. His books have sought to tackle the myths around Israel and Zionism, providing much-needed insight, information, thoughtfulness, and nuanced reflections. He is one of the major historians of our times writing on Palestine. As the current aggression and genocide in Gaza continue well into its 10th month, Professor Ilan Pappé encourages us to understand the root of the violence, the illegal occupation of Palestine. Professor Ilan Pappé is an Israeli historian and socialist activist. He is a professor with the College of Social Sciences and International Studies at the University of Exeter, Director of the university's European Centre for Palestine Studies and co-director of the Exeter Centre for Ethno-Political Studies. His latest book is 10 Myths About Israel. His books also include The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine and The Idea of Israel, A History of Power and Knowledge. Professor Pappé's research focuses on the modern Middle East and in particular the history of Israel and Palestine. I'm so glad he's my guest today. Professor Ilan Pappé, welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I'm so thrilled to be speaking to you.
Thank you, Samia. It's a great pleasure for me to be on your program and show. Thank you for having me.
You have been doing for decades some really phenomenal work. I want to go back a little bit. You were born in Haifa and in Israel, where you grew up, and you lived for a good number of years, and you even served in the Israeli army as a young person in 1973 in the 1973 war. What was it like for you growing up in Israel, and what really led to your change in trajectory, change in opinion, change in views, and what's led to you becoming the advocate you are today for the Palestinian cause?
Yeah, I had what one can say a conventional Israeli Jewish upbringing and education, very much young Israeli man, school, army, university, with very little awareness of history or even what was going on around me. And it was only when I was beginning to build my professional career as a historian, which took me to Britain in the very early 1980s, that I began to view more critically the history of the place I was born into, the current realities. It was a combination of professional interest in history and also the location of doing the research outside of Israel, very much in contact with Palestinians and Arab intellectuals and historians, which was something I could not have done in Israel itself, that helped to produce a very different outlook on the reality. There is not a moment of truth there or epiphany. This is usually a journey. It's a journey that has stations in it. And I suppose there is a moment where you look back and you understand that you're really far away from where you started. And in many ways, there's no way going back. You don't want to go back. You are at peace with yourself. So I suppose it's a mixture of one's own moral constitution, professional interest, and conditions and circumstances that allow you to have a vantage point that is a bit different from the rest of your society, to see things that maybe from the inside it was not that easy to see and understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you grew up in the 70s and the 80s, a time that didn't have the internet as we have it today, and TV and all the different like access to information. And so I guess I can imagine that you're not really aware of not only like the situation that you're in, to not realize that actually I don't have a variety of voices around me. I don't have the academic even freedom that I long for, because you don't have anything almost to compare it to, and you don't have that outside information coming in like it is today. And it's interesting because you've described it as a journey, and I can definitely imagine that is the case. I don't presume that you woke up one day and suddenly were like, oh my goodness, this is a settler colonial state and I need to do something about it. But it's interesting also in your writing. So I understand that your writing pre-2006 was also quite cautious, I think, as you were still forming your views, but also perhaps understanding what it was that you wanted to do with that. Can you describe that a little bit? So that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine came out in 2006, and that is very clear. Your views are very clear. Your language is very strong, you know what you want to say and how you want to say it. But what led to you becoming so certain that this is not only what you think, but what you now must do as a historian?
Yeah, first of all, you're definitely right. It takes time for the ideas to mature in many ways, and it's not easy to liberate yourself from indoctrination and prejudices that you were born with and you were educated about. So definitely it's an evolutionary process for sure. I think what led to the kind of articulation that you can see in the ethnic cleansing is mainly two things. One is very mundane in a way. The Israeli art were operating, that don't do it anymore now, but in those days, they were operating according to the British law of declassification of documents. And the British law of declassification says that you first release documents after 30 years. So the document of 48 were first released in 1978. And you release more sensitive documents 50 years later. So that would be 1998, where it was still relatively easy to access some of the documentation in the Israeli archives, which, as I say, today is not the case. And it was the most sensitive documentation that I was able to access in the late 1990s compared to the documents of the 1930s that were the first reason, or one of the two reasons that I mentioned, that led me to be far more assertive of what happened in 1948, namely not just knowing what happened here and there, but having a better understanding of the big picture. The second reason is as important, and that is I started writing the ethnic cleansing during the outbreak of the Second Intifada. And the Second Intifada spilled over into Israel itself. So in many ways, it was not unlike the First Intifada. It encompassed historical Palestine in its entirety. And there were the features or characteristics of the Second Intifada that at least allowed me to understand better the nature of the Zionist project, the nature of the Palestinian resistance to the Zionist project, recreating the moments of the Nakba, understanding it better, and so on. So it was a combination of current affairs, if you want, with everything is around you, and more material. It would be like someone who, let's say, is very young and just starts now a dissertation, and they want to write a PhD in Cambridge about 1948, and they do it while watching the genocide unfolding in Gaza. I think it would be a very different dissertation from someone who wrote, let's say, during the Oslo Accord years. Whatever we think about them, they were relatively quiet years. And I'm sure that's a different kind of dissertation. And if you write it under the influence of what you can see now when the Nakba unfolds again in front of your eyes, probably even a chapter that is worse than Nakba unfolds in front of your eyes and so on. So I think that played a very important role to make sure. And time is a factor here. You need time to be confident in your views. It takes time to get also reassurances from your Palestinian friends that you're in the right direction, from other people. And it takes time to build up. And then suddenly it happens and then it comes up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in knowing, because I understand that like a lot of that process for you is or was like an internal growth academically, but also personally as well. But what happened to you in your life and your living circumstances? How was that impacted by your decision and by the firming of your stance? I understand that you were dismissed from your role at the university, but what else did you face? What kind of backlash did you face, and censorship of your work and so forth?
Yeah, it went together, I must say, because even before I published the book around 2001, 2002, I made my views in my university to my students, to my colleagues, to the public, through the media if they were interested in my views. And the backlash was really treating me as a traitor, and even worse, from the government up to neighbors and society, condemnation and the threats and so on. I think it's an important test because had I not been totally convinced that I'm right in what I'm doing, if I wasn't even, I was only 90% sure that what I'm saying about the past is true, that what I'm saying about the present is true, if I was only 90% confident, I would have probably find it difficult to continue under such a barrage of condemnation, threats, and so on. But because by 2001, 2002, when this kind of personal attack became more formidable from the university, from the government, from the media, because by then, apparently, I was already very confident that morally, professionally, factually, I'm on the right side. It's tough because I had small children and they were threatened as well. So we did decide to leave eventually. But that never undermined or never brought a moment of hesitation. Should you change a little bit your tone, maybe change your language? Some people offered, some of my friends suggested maybe tame your vocabulary and so on. And I said, no, if I do that, it means that I'm not sure. But I'm totally sure. And that's very important lesson, I think, that you can withstand a lot if you are you have your own inner truth. And if you don't, that's okay. It's a human nature. It's okay not to be in that situation. But I think it's good to be challenged because then you know how determined you are that you're doing the right thing. If you're not, maybe you're not doing the right thing. It's possible. Again, this is not accusation of people who don't. I'm just saying that in a way, I was lucky to feel so confident. Maybe because I'm an historian, because these were not just moral, ideological views. They were, of course. But for me, they were very much substantiated by a very profound research into history. And therefore, it was not that easy to move me or remove me from these kinds of positions.
So I think, like a lot of us around the world, going through and have been going through for a number of years, a process of being really discontent with governments, especially our own governments. I'll speak to my own experience. So I'm living in the UK, I'm British, born and bred in London. And the more we see what our government is doing around the world, the more we are learning about what they have done historically. I think especially I am Pakistani. My parents emigrated from Pakistan in the 70s. The more I understand and I learn about what was done in pre-partition India and even following that, it's really difficult to hold space for grace when it comes to a country like the United Kingdom. But I think that can really do something to your own identity and your own understanding of belonging. But as a historian as well, I can imagine that there's even more depth and even more complications when it comes to that, especially when we're talking about Israel. How have you been able to navigate that? And you've spoken about family as well. Like, how do you still hold on or respect in some ways your own identity and belonging, but also be so sure that this is the work that you need to do to call out the Israeli state?
Yeah. No, definitely. These are questions I keep asking myself because I'm still holding Israeli citizenship. I would like still to be in Haifa in the Galilee, where there are still more than 1 million Palestinians usually quite forgotten Palestinians, and I wrote a book about them called The Forgotten Palestinians. This is where the Nakba occurred. This is where a lot of Palestinians still live. And I feel very much connected organically, ideologically, and socially to this group of Palestinians, which gives me a lot of strength. And that's why I do try to be here. Of course, if I won't be able to do it, I won't be able to do it. But as long as I can, I do. And that creates a certain problems, of course, because Israel still has 8 million Jews living there. Some of them are my own family and so on. So it complicates family relationship. It complicates your relationship with the public around it. And in many ways, it would have been easier to be in London, not to visit, not to come back to Israel at all, and just be the supportive voice of the Palestinian resistance and liberation. And that's, in a way, it's easier to do it from there. And for many Palestinians, my friends would say that's what you should do anyway. We shouldn't be there. I understand this position. I don't accept it. I think that the Palestinians who are there need also allies inside, not just allies outside. Again, my inside alliance does not only depend on me. I don't know for how long I can do it, but as long as I can. But I do admit it's a kind of, it's not a lack of confidence, because as I said, I know exactly what I'm doing. It just, I think you use the word navigation. I think it's true. It's navigating, because some of the people here are friends from your school. Some of them, as I said, are family members. You don't demonize them. You don't think all of them are inhuman or about terrible people. But you are fully aware of what they are doing, what they have been doing, and you feel it's your job also to tell them what they are doing and face them with the mirror. So sometimes they don't like the mirror, so they don't like the person who holds the mirror. But I will hold the mirror in front of them as long as I can do this. I think it's important. I always say that in order to have a just decolonization or liberation of Palestine, it's not a precondition that the Jews who live today in Israel would agree to this. We don't have to wait for them to change their minds. But it would help if at least some of them would share my, not in full, at least in part, my views. And I'm not alone, I should say. There are young and older Israelis who think, but let's not idealize it. It's a very small group. But nonetheless, increasing that group, I think, is important. It is also important because I'm also a historian of decolonization. And as Samia, not always, Pakistan and India is a good example. Even if you liberate yourself from colonial rule, it can be a very bloody, violent event. And if a country is born, even if it frees itself through violence, the violence stays with you, as Franz Fanon warned us. So I think there's something there also to be part of this total identification with the Palestinian resistance and resilience on the one hand, but hoping that you're helping to make the transition as humane and as less violent as possible. Because it would be difficult given everything the Israelis have been doing to the Palestinians in the last century. But nonetheless, working there. So I feel very much at home in this position, which does not negate my commitment to do what I do abroad. I teach in Britain. I live a part of the time in Britain, and I go around the world to talk about it. This is, for me, a sacred mission that I will do as long as I can. But I also think working with the people themselves inside is as important as giving them a voice outside.
That's so interesting. And do you, how has your reception or your acceptance in Israel changed over the last 20 years? Because I know that obviously when you first started writing so strongly, I can imagine that there were even fewer voices holding the same position that you were holding in it. And you've mentioned already that was really challenging. But how is it now, especially in light of everything that's going on at the moment?
Yeah, it's very difficult in the sense that I don't have that many Jewish friends anymore, or any more relatives who are willing to talk to me. So most of my social media are Palestinians. And I live not in Haifa, I live more in the Galilee, with very near and part of the Palestinian community. But I still find it important to talk to people. I always happy to find out, and I do find out another two persons who do things like I do. And it happens all the time. These are not in huge numbers, but there's always someone new every day that I didn't know of, that gives me hope, who really understand the realities I do and share the vision for the future. And that's very encouraging for me. Although I'm fully aware, I'm talking here about a very small minority. I don't want to create the impression that something dramatic is happening there. But the fact that it is there, and some of them are young people, gives me hope and gives me energy to work. But again, I don't separate it from my analysis, which I shared with you before. I don't think that this is the precondition. I think, and I don't only think, I believe that even if we won't succeed, and which is quite possible, of changing the views of most Israeli Jews about the future, if they won't change, like the whites in South Africa change, still believe in apartheid, I don't think they will succeed in preventing, historically. I don't know when, not tomorrow, probably not the day after tomorrow. I don't think they will be able to prevent finally the liberation of Palestine. It will happen. I think for their own sake, they should be part of it rather than be the force against it. But I'm realistic. I know that this may not happen. I'm trying to make sure that at least a little bit of it is happening. So this is where I navigate. I navigate through these conversations with people. Most of them, anyway, don't want to have these conversations in Israel, so that's easy. But those who are willing, who are truly willing, I find that I do get through them. I mean, if there's already a person who's willing to listen, it's very difficult after talking to me, I think, not to share these views, because it's some of these people, their viewpoint is based on ignorance. It's not that they know that much, and because some of it is based on ignorance. So if they have a modicum of humanity, decency in them, it can work. But again, it's a very specific kind of
because I feel very similar in the sense that just being completely outside and just being an activist in the online space, but in the real world also, so many times people will say, "Oh, are you speaking to quote unquote the other side? Are you speaking to Zionists?" And my position is just that no, because as you said, you have to be. You can only speak to people that are willing to speak to you, that are willing to listen. If somebody is coming from the perspective that they don't want to have dialogue, they don't want to look at the facts or to be open to looking at things from a different perspective, there is no point. There is too much work to be doing right now for us, I think, to be butting heads and just trying to have conversations when there's not a conversation. So I fully
agree with you there. If I would have lived 100% in Britain, I mean, if my own realm of activity would have been only in Britain, I wouldn't waste time looking for a dialogue with the Zionists. I would say to myself, my urgent mission is to convince those in the public and the government who are still not convinced that they have to do more for Palestine. And I wouldn't waste any moment or anything else. Yeah. That's what I would have. And that's what, by the way, that's what I'm doing when I'm outside.
Yeah.
And the same when you're in the inside, you sometimes take upon yourself some other missions in a way, because you're from that society, you speak the language of that society. And I also find, by the way, there's a big difference between talking to Anglo-Zionists, people who are Zionists in Britain, and talking to people who are here. It's a different kind of conversation. It is as difficult. And as we both said, if they don't want to have a conversation, there's no conversation. Who cares? But if they do want to have the conversation, they come from a different perspective than someone who sits in London or in Washington. And that's why I like Haifa in many ways. Haifa for me is very different from Jerusalem, for instance. Both cities have large Arab and Jewish communities, but Haifa is the only place probably today in historical Palestine where, for historical reasons, there are still some spaces, not many, and one should not romanticize them, but some spaces where you still can see Palestinians and Jews dialoguing on a more equal footing, which you won't see anywhere else in Israel, definitely not in the occupied West Bank or in siege Gaza Strip. Yeah.
Speaking of the Gaza Strip, at the time that we're speaking, we're almost 10 months into this aggression and into the genocide, and it is unlike anything I've witnessed in my life, and I'm sure the same actually goes for you. As a historian, what do you think are the most important historical contexts and facts that people need to understand in order to understand the genocide that's unfolding in front of us?
Yeah, I think these contexts are like circles. It begins with a very relatively distant past, and then you slowly approach the more relevant contexts. So the more distant context, which is important, is the very act of creating the Zionist movement as a settler colonial movement that came to Palestine in the late 19th century, not only to save Jews from anti-Semitism or of immigrants who were seeking a better future, which is understandable, but came with the ideology, like all settler colonial movements, that it has to get rid of the local native indigenous population. This is the first act of violence against the Palestinians. And it's very difficult to convince Western media and academia that this is where you start the conflict. Because people say, this Palestinians are violent, Israelis are violent, and you say, yes, of course, but let's go to this. If you want to solve it, let's go to the source of violence. It's very important to understand the source. And the source of violence is people coming from an outside and coveting someone's homeland and are already contemplating in their mind, because they didn't have the power to do it when they arrived, but already contemplating how this place would look without the indigenous native population. So I think that's the wider, the very distant context. Then you go a bit closer in time. You go to 1948, and you have to remember how the Gaza Strip was created. That it was created as part of the Israeli ethnic cleansing operation. When Israel was born, its leaders felt they had an historical opportunity to try and get rid of as many Palestinians as possible and take as much as Palestine as possible. They were able to take about 80% of Palestine and get rid of half of the Palestinian population. The way they did it was to push them to Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, but they were not able to push them to Egypt, as they are not able to push now the people of Gaza to Egypt. And because of that, although they had the power to take over what today is the Gaza Strip, they decided not to take it, and instead created it as a huge mega refugee camp. So you already have the creation of a strip. It's very important to inform people that Gaza was not a strip. Gaza was a cosmopolitical city that until the late 1920s, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived there peacefully together. It was on the way, on the Via Maris, the road on the sea. It was very open. It has a thriving agricultural community around it. It's also very important to understand this is not how there was no strip. And it became a strip because of this Israeli design. And in it, you have another kind of mini context that many of the people who found themselves as refugees in Palestine, in the strips, were evicted from villages on whose ruins some of the settlements that were attacked on the 7th of October were built. So you have here an emotional connection. And we have to remember that 70% of the people in Gaza are refugees from 1948. And then you move to a more closer context that begins in 67, 56 occupation that violates every possible rule in international law, abuses people, harasses people, arresting them without trial, demolishing their houses, killing, banishing, and so on. So you have here, and that's true about the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which are organically connected. So it doesn't matter if it happens in Gaza or in Ramallah. It's the Palestinian experience of 56 years of occupation with false hopes being developed by the United States through false peace programs and so on. So you have this context, which is very important. And finally, of course, you have the context of the last 17 years. The people of Gaza democratically decide to give the leadership of the Hamas a chance because the other leadership, the Palestinian Authority, to their mind, is unable to end this kind of occupation reality. They're giving them a chance, and Israel reacts by imposing siege blockade on them in 2007, and Hamas reacts to this siege, and you have 17 years of which include 4 horrific assaults by the Israeli army with all its most lethal weapons from the air, the sea, and land that not only kill thousands of Palestinians and wounds 10,000, many of them are children, it traumatizes the whole population in such a way that it's still a miracle that you still can hear people speaking normally and still trying to reason with life after living in this ghetto for 17 years. All these contexts have to be taken into account, not to justify everything that Hamas did or whoever joined them on the 7th of October. Not every explanation is justification, but every justification is important if you want to solve the issue. If you want to say, I don't want this to happen again. And if you don't have these contexts, it will happen again and again. Yeah.
You wrote in Cleansing of Palestine, you wrote that the Nakba in 1948 was, by the international community, that it was noted but not condemned. And I feel like we are in the exact same position at the moment. It feels like the international community is noting what is happening. Nobody is denying, some people are denying, but generally people are not denying what is happening because of the sheer amount of evidence that we have. But the condemnation is not there. What do you think about this seemingly history repeating itself?
I think there is a difference. I agree that as far as governments are concerned, the people with the power to stop a genocide or ethnic cleansing or act against those who commit these crimes against humanity, yes, we have the same level of indifference and unwillingness to act. But there's a difference. There was no civil society supporting the Palestinians in 1948. And this is a big difference, not because the civil society has the power to stop the genocide, as we can see, but because it will have the power to change the reality in the future. And that we didn't have in 1948. So I think that's very important. And it's important because it also shows the changes that the Western societies underwent in those years. In 1948, there was a more homogeneous kind of Western societies with not that many immigrants coming from other countries. It was not diversified. It was not multicultural. And therefore, it was much easier to manipulate by the political elite to echo the position of the political elite. I think the great thing that happened is indeed the diversification in the kind of societies we have today in the West. Yes, it is not reflected yet in policies from above, but it's very important. I know how difficult it is, for instance, for the Muslim community in Britain to take the lead on the issue of Palestine, because immediately Islamophobia is activated. Say, this is not a concern of the British people, it's just these Muslims who came from, even if your father was born in Britain, they would still say, these are, I don't have to tell you, you probably know about it more than I do, but I can see myself being in Britain for so many years. But I think it is very important. It is very important. And what is really, for me, inspiring is that you have a similar commitment from a core group in the Jewish community. It's not just the Muslim community. Jews who were at the forefront in fighting for justice against apartheid in South Africa, against racism in Britain, are also part of that commitment. Look at, and then you have the people who are not Jews and not Muslims who were always, we can call them the left, but they can be also in the Liberal Party. And as I wrote in my last book, Lobbying for Zionism, there were quite a few people in the Conservative Party who were good human beings who could not be sit idle knowing what's happening to the Palestinians. So there is a kind of an alliance where all these people from different backgrounds sometimes, from maybe different perspective, but are united by humanity. And that's why I think Zionism is going to fail, because it fails the test of humanity. And it doesn't matter if you view humanity through the eyes of a faithful person who is a Muslim, a Christian, or a Jew, namely someone more religious. If you examine it through the eyes of a liberal, maybe more secular person, for whatever direction we look at it, if humanity is our guide, is our driver, they fail the test. They really fail the test. And that wasn't there in 48. It wasn't there in 48. There was not enough information, not enough people in your own society that would help you to say, wait a minute, where else on whose side should we really be? This is not a big question for us. Very clear to us whom we should support here, which was not clear to people back in 1940.
Yeah. And here actually I want to talk about your most recent book that's out, because I know you're constantly working on things, but your book, which is about the 10 myths of Israel. And what I find interesting, really, when I think about the way that discourse is changing and that civil society is changing, is that it is becoming clearer, at least to some groups, what those myths are. And the fact that there are even myths, because for so long there has been a mainstream narrative. Why do you think that mainstream narrative with all these myths was upheld for so long? And what do you think we can do to really understand the actual reality of the Israeli state?
Yeah. First of all, if you want a certain set of myths to maintain their validity or their influence and their acceptance as truth, especially in a changing reality where the facts on the ground keep challenging those myths, you need a lot of effort. You need to invest a lot of effort in maintenance. And in another book of mine called The Idea of Israel, I examined how both Israeli academia and cinema industry were recruited to this project of maintenance. So it's not enough just to throw these myths as sound bites or slogans. You have to work to provide them with academic scaffolding, with big Hollywood films that plant among people the images of the bad Arab, the great Israeli Jew, and so on. This took effort and money and resources, and that's one of the main reasons of the longevity of this kind of a propaganda that survived. And and it was very effective. It was run by people who knew the job of PR or propaganda, call it what you want. And as I show in another book I just published, Lobbying for Zionism, for 100 years they worked hard on it. Now, and we have to challenge it, because this narrative provides immunity for the actions on the ground. So we have to puncture this shield. And the way to do it, I think, has to do with learning what gives these myths their strengths, their validity. So one place is academia. And we sometimes think of the academia as a place where it should be the space for student encampments and protests and so on. And of course, a highly important part of activism is that. However, I think we tend to underestimate the importance of the other role in academia, the production of knowledge, the dissemination of knowledge. We have a lot of work still to do there, because the journalists of tomorrow, the politicians of tomorrow, would access their information from these kinds of places of learning, of research. And we have to revolutionize these places when it comes to Palestine, and through scholarly work, challenge them, to make sure that our challenges are also written in an accessible language. So, the problem with academics is even if they have the courage, which they don't always have, to challenge a myth, they sometimes write it in such a language because that's the only way a very good journal will publish them.
Mm.
That means that apart from them and the editors, nobody else would read this which might be a very important finding. And you have to popularize these findings to make it yours. So that's one way of doing it. I think that's also very important to continue with the alternative media. This is again something we didn't have. Yes, the alternative media has a lot of, as I know to tell you, there's a lot of dangers, there's a lot of fake news, and now we are facing censorship by those who are providing us with a platform. Not easy, we have a huge challenger, but nonetheless, it's very important. It's working. People are willing to listen to probably history lessons about Palestine that they cannot get in the university or cannot get in high school if they're high school kids, or cannot find in the mainstream media. You need to build the confidence, and I think some of the websites that are focusing on Palestine, like Electronic Intifada, Palestine Chronicle, Middle East Eye, I remember when they started, not everybody was that easily attracted to them. They said, how can we trust them? We don't know these people and so on. But they built, people understand that they are the truthful reporters of the realities on the ground, and therefore you can also trust when they invite historians or scholars and so on to share information about the past. They have the confidence, or they have the trust, or rather, that's what I mean, they have the trust of people. And I think together, this working in academia, alternative media, would put a challenge to the mainstream media that really, not only on Palestine, but let's focus today on Palestine, when it comes to Palestine, has betrayed its profession. Very respectful institution, which I admired as a kid, the BBC, has really betrayed, even the Guardian at times, betrayed their role of professionalism because of intimidation, because of lack of knowledge, whatever. They're getting better, and I think they're getting better because we're fighting, because we're struggling, not because they suddenly woke up and said, oh, let's change. There are fruits to this kind of challenging that is important to continue.
So one of the things that I'm increasingly confused about, so the Israeli or the Zionist narrative or their arguments with regards to what happened during the Second World War, even if we hear what they're saying about October the 7th, there seems to be, for their own Jewish Israeli community, a lot of compassion. This is about security, this is about protection, it's about conservation, future generations and children, and what have you. But those values that are actually universal are not extended anywhere else, but especially not to the people of Palestine. And I think the thing that is really difficult to understand right now is we're seeing directly the awful tactics, the absolutely terrible tactics that are being used by the Israeli forces, the unleashing of dogs on children and elderly women, the awful tools and whatnot being used and the impact that's having on children. We're seeing the outbreak of disease. We're seeing images where limbs have fallen off and babies' heads have been blown off. But still, we're not seeing any sense of these universal values of compassion and justice and human rights coming from any form of the Israeli lobby. And to me, it doesn't, I can't comprehend it. Where do you think that comes from, and what do you think is really going on?
I think it doesn't start in the lobby. It starts with the way Israeli Jews are dealing with compassion for the other, or not dealing with compassion to the other. And it has to do, first of all, with the nature of settler colonial movements, that they have to dehumanize the people that they want to get rid of. Otherwise, it's difficult to do this. So dehumanization of the Palestinians is an integral, organic part of the Zionist education before 1948 and the Israeli education after 1948. And because the Israeli political system has moved to the right in the last 20, 25 years, this dehumanization is even worse in the current educational system. So it starts with the way people are manipulated to have no compassion. And you dehumanize people by comparing them to the Nazis, by claiming that they are subhumans, by various means of doing it. And the Israelis are not the first one to do it. Many other, unfortunate people did it in the past. Then you have the objective reality that you can exploit, namely, you are occupying people, you're pressuring them, you are committing crimes against them, and some of them react. And they react with violence. So you exploit that violence to say, these are the people you're dealing with, what we talked in the very beginning. You decontextualize the acts of violence of those who are defending themselves, or really are defending. And that lack of compassion is very important. But I think you raise a very important question. While I can understand why the lack of compassion is so prevalent among Israeli Jews, I'm horrified by it, but I understand where it comes from, so the media, education, politicians, and so on. And as I say, exploiting the Palestinian resistance for that purpose. I'm surprised by those who are really representing Israel, the lobby in Britain, for instance. And I really wonder, I think that they are busy, but that's not because I've researched it, but that's my sense with talking of some of them. They are really investing huge efforts to justify to themselves these positions. Because they're not parrots who just repeat what people tell them to repeat. They want to believe that everything he's doing is correct, but like us, they know a bit more than we used to know. And it's a jugglery of emotions, of reasoning, and so on. Why do I say it? Because from time to time I have to face them in panels and so on, and I'm amazed at the amount of energy that they invest in order to square this circle. The square and the circle is what we all know is happening, and the kind of justification. And I wonder about the younger generation of those whose parents are at the forefront of the lobbying for Zionism in Britain today. I wonder if they would continue with this. In a way, I'm quite hopeful. I think it becomes more and more difficult to justify. I'm not saying they're not doing it. It's like this, I don't remember the name of this member of parliament who every time someone spoke about Palestine, he said, but I want to remind people that the figures we hear about the dead in Gaza are the figures of the Hamas. We cannot trust them. And there was no one there to say to him, so what? Tell us your figures, okay? Tell us your figures. Okay, if you don't want to. Instead, and that gave him a sense of immunity. So it's not 35,000. To my mind, it's only 22,000, as if this is in any way. So I think these kinds of very bizarre methods keep them without any human compassion. For me, as a Jew, for a Jewish community with all the Jews have gone through in Europe is unacceptable. Totally unacceptable, ununderstandable. I have to accept the fact. Yeah, that's what we're facing.
Yeah. I don't know if you will be able to answer this question, but we're in 2024, in a world where nothing is hidden, and clearly Israel know what they're doing. They are committing a genocide because they want to get rid of the Palestinian people. They want to take over the land, fundamentally, in the most simplest of terms. But and we have spoken about the silence that has come from international decision makers. But what is it in particular that allows them to use the horrific tactics that they are using? I just feel like it's crossed so many lines.
Yeah.
It's not just about killing people, like the extent to which the torture that's taking place, the extent to which this is happening. This is one of the things that I'm struggling with, is the extent of which all of this is happening. In your, I don't know, in your opinion or in your mind, like, why do you think this is being allowed to continue in the way that it is?
First of all, is what happened on the 7th of October. I mean, they've never faced such a high number of casualties, and we still don't have all the facts, but they have a certain narrative about what happened, and that gives people the sense that we're dealing here with a Nazi operation, so we're entitled to do this. So I think that's one level, but I think that would not have been enough, because it should have worked for the first 3 or 4 weeks. I think it comes back to this dehumanization, the fact that it's a very indoctrinated society from cradle to the grave, and it's very difficult, it's very easy rather to manipulate people. And especially it's interesting who are the people who are so easily manipulated. It's the people who are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. Many people who came from Arab countries who were discriminated themselves by the Israeli European Jews. It's a certain kind of group of people that on the one hand are deprived socially and economically. And you know that sometimes groups like this are sometimes easy to manipulate. And the settler community, which became big in Israel, really a large chunk of the Israeli Jewish society, Messianic Jews, who by the way, don't only view the Palestinians as inhuman, but also the secular Jews. I mean, this is the first stage in their vision of what Israel should do. The secular Jews are the next in their ideas of people who have to be expunged, not just the Palestinians. The world doesn't understand that. And therefore you have this very dangerous mixture that in the past allowed fascism and Nazism to emerge, or the popular support for dictatorships in Latin America and so on. We never should think about that as a unique example only. I mean, there's historical parallels, and yes, it is very toxic here, and very reminds me of really dark times in history where it's like people with amok and their eyes are blind to anything else but a wish to kill, to torture. And it doesn't matter whether it's a baby or a soldier. It's a kind of an orgy of killing, of carnage, almost a trick without taking the drugs. But I still hope, somewhere in me, I still hope that this is the initial reaction, and maybe there will be another more calm or sober reaction to what happens. But those sober people are leaving Israel. We're left with a very unpromising future as far as the Israeli Jews are concerned. But luckily, as I said 3 times, I think already in this interview, they are not going to stop in the long run a free Palestine, but they will make it more difficult to get.
Yeah. And speaking of the future, like your idea of a solution is a one-state solution. Can you describe what you think that has to look like?
Yeah, just to it has 2 elements. One is this element of equality. What Palestinians never enjoyed was equality, normal life, and so on. So the one state is a state where there is no ideology that discriminates against people on any basis. But it's also a state that rectifies past evils, allowing the return of the refugees, compensation, and so on, redistribution of resources, and so on. But I also think it's one that connects back both to the past and to the region. Because I think that the one state that I have in mind is not a European nation state. It's far more has to do with the legacies of the Eastern Mediterranean, where communities lived together, even if people were still loyal to their own collectives, whether Druze, Alawites, Yazidis, and so on, but they knew how to live together. And Muslim Christians and Jews in particular knew how to live together before the arrival of Zionism. So it's not just a democratic state, which is important for me, in equality, but it's also a state that looks at the past not as a primitive legacy we should not consider, but rather an inspiration. You don't recreate the past, of course, many things have changed, but you do go back to the moment where you say, we were part of an area, we're part of Islamic civilization, even if not all of us were part of Islamic religion. we were part of a mosaic of different communities that knew how to live together in a genuine way. All this, of course, needs a lot of thinking and working on it. But as an inspiration, I think it has a very good chance of creating a far more normal and peaceful society. No society will be perfect. And I think it will radiate and influence countries around Palestine as well, who also need some ideas for how to, because their current realities in Syria or Lebanon, definitely Libya or Yemen, is also not where it should be. People deserve a much better life there as well.
Yeah. Well, sir, thank you so much for your time. It has been such a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you, Samia. It was great to be with you, and hope to see you soon.
If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.